Dr. Jaishankar, you mentioned in your remarks that you have just come from Fiji. With India's near region considered to be the Indian Ocean countries, can you give us your assessment of the Pacific, what it means to India, and what you see as opportunities for India-Australia collaboration?
Well, you know, if I were to speak about the Pacific broadly, one of the big changes which has happened in India over the last 3 decades is that the bulk of our trade has actually shifted eastwards. It's more than 50% of our trade today is to countries east of India. Obviously, most of them are Pacific countries. And that's in a way a huge shift from the earlier colonial era trade patterns and routings which were centered around the western coast and to European and Middle Eastern markets. Specifically where the Pacific Islands are concerned, because I was in Fiji, again this is a region where we have some history. I think the first set of Indian immigrants came to Fiji, for example, I think in 1879. There's a large Fijian Indian community there. So one part of our interest is obviously the historical cultural linkages. But in recent years, as our own, we have ourselves globalized in thinking of our interests in global terms. We actually created a forum called Forum for India-Pacific Island Cooperation. We've had 2 meetings. This was done by Prime Minister Modi. It was one of his early initiatives in 2014. We've done 2 meetings. We would have done a third but for the COVID. We hope to do it this year. And we today have development assistance programs in every one of the Pacific Islands. We were providers of vaccines during COVID to about 5 of them, if my memory serves me right, 5 or 6 of them. Certainly to Fiji, I know, but to a number of others as well. So I think what you should expect to see is a greater Indian presence, a greater Indian commitment, because it's not just a political commitment, it's also a sustainability commitment, and in many, there are islands where we are active in health, some of them in, we are getting into education. So it's therefore a region and a subject where we hope to consult very closely with Australia and work together in a way in which our convergences are enhanced.
Right. Minister, you clearly see the convergences there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, our government has had much deeper engagement with the Pacific as one of our key, perhaps our key foreign policy initiative since May. But we've also noticed and very much welcome the engagement of like-minded countries in the Pacific and step up. India is one. I've discussed with my friend Jean-Pierre the potential collaboration for more collaboration between Australia and France on climate financing in the Pacific, for example. Germany's just appointed a new ambassador for the Pacific. So we very much welcome all these steps up from from around the world in deeper engagement in the Pacific, and there are key opportunities, I think, for ongoing partnerships of Australia working with countries like India on projects right throughout the Pacific.
Lovely. Before asking if anyone in the audience has a question for the 2 ministers, Dr. Jaishankar, a lot of your commentary was focused on democracy and furthering democracy and different forms of democracy. There are occasional comments that we see on the undermining of democracy in India, most recently in the context of the BBC, and just yesterday at the Munich Security Conference, George Soros spoke on many issues, but specifically on open and closed societies, and called on institutional reform in India. How do you, as Foreign Minister of India, explain this when you're dealing with your Quad ministers in particular, as well as others?
Well, look, I actually made 2 points. One, how the world is changing. It is rebalancing. It is less Euro-Atlantic. I don't think everybody gets that. I think old habits die hard. I mean, very candidly, there are still people in the world who believe that their definition, their preferences, their views must override everything else. So, since you mentioned this specific example, I don't know how familiar people are with what was said at the Munich conference. Essentially, Mr. Soros said India is a democratic country, but he doesn't think the Prime Minister of India is a Democrat. By the way, a few years ago, in the same conference, I was there at that time, he actually accused us of planning to strip millions of Muslims of their citizenship, which of course didn't happen. It was a ridiculous suggestion. But you have to understand what this actually means. I could take a view that the individual in question, Mr. Soros, is a old, rich, opinionated person sitting in New York who still thinks that his views should determine how the entire world works. Now, if I could only stop at old, rich and opinionated, I would put it away. But he is old, rich, opinionated and dangerous, because what happens is when such people and such views and such organizations, they actually invest resources in shaping narratives. I spoke about globalization. Now, what globalization does is it actually creates lot of the seamlessness of globalization, which creates all the opportunities, also allows narratives to be shaped, money to come in, foundations to go about their agenda. Now, in this particular case, I mean, it is very clear that he has very strong political preferences. He actually thinks that, I mean, doesn't matter that this is a country of 1.4 billion people, we are almost there, whose voters decide how the country should run. He actually thinks, well, if, and again, I cite him as an extreme example, okay, but there are other, manifestations of this in different countries, where people like him think an election is good if the person we want to see wins. If the election throws up a different outcome, then we actually will say it's a flawed democracy. This to my and the beauty is all this is done under the pretense of advocacy of open society, of transparency, etc. So our generation, we have grown up with concepts like regime change, which influence operations. Now, you can call it what you will. I mean, to me, this really looks the same, with a gloss of some kind of do-goodism on it. So, for me, it's actually necessary today that we have today a serious conversation on democracy. When I look at my own democracy, I mean, I have today a voter turnout which is unprecedented, electoral outcomes which are decisive, electoral processes which are not questioned. We are not one of those countries where after the election somebody goes to arbitrate in court. Okay? We don't have any hanging chads either. And where you actually say, I will sit in judgment over the verdict of voters. Now, my sense of democracy is the voters are supposed to decide. And it worries us because, look, we are a country which went through colonialism. We know the dangers of what happens when there is outside interference in whatever guise in your politics. If you do this kind of scaremongering, like millions of people will be deprived of citizenship, it actually does real damage to our societal fabric, because somebody out there believes you, and you don't leave it to accident, by the way, you back it up with an operation. So you create that kind of fear psychosis, and then you use that to validate your original judgment. So I do think today, between whose democracy, whose globalization, why the transparency of how global processes work, these are real issues which need to be debated.
I saw Gordon Flake all the way from Perth for the Raisina at Sydney. Fantastic to have you here, Gordon.
Delighted to make sure that we've got coverage from Australia's Indian Ocean capital. Gordon Flake with the Perth US Asia Centre. A question for Minister Jaishankar. I wonder if I might get your reaction to the comments that Minister Bowen made about the importance of renewable energy supply chains and his focus on India as a trusted and reliable partner par excellence. We had last year both your ministerial colleagues, Minister Joshi, Minister Goyal, visit. In October, the Japanese Prime Minister visited Western Australia with an intense focus on those clean energy supply chains, with the notion that the road to future energy went through Australia. I wonder if you might address and respond to Minister Bowen's comments in terms of how India views Australia when it comes to energy security and future energy.
I'm not an energy guy, but I'm a sort of jack of all trades. So I'll have a shot at the answer. My sense is a lot of countries are re-looking at their energy future. They're re-looking at the energy future for some of the reasons which Minister Bowen spoke about, that there's today a great deal of anxiety on the fossil fuel, on the accessibility, on the affordability, on the volatility of those markets. There's worry when it comes to renewables, that are we excessively dependent on particular geographies, and there could be disruptions there, but there could be leveraging there, call it what you will, but dependence is dependence. So to my mind, what happens, and what has happened even in the past, when the world starts getting nervous about a particular set of concerns, there's almost an intuitive sense in the world that let's go out there and look for different solutions, different arrangements, different transactions which will, as I said, de-risk all of us. I think when in our case, we are thinking about it very actively. We know we are not the only country which is thinking about it. It's also been a subject of conversation in the Quad, in other formats as well, I would say. And certainly we see Australia as a particularly important partner here, because if the future, we see the future as more renewable, we see the future as more nuclear, we see the future as more green hydrogen, green ammonia. Now, each of these, we see EV will mean the capital letters will become stronger with the passage of time. Many of these roads do lead to Australia. So I do think that the energy side of our relationship, but I wouldn't put it just as energy. I would really put it as a kind of an economic security side of the relationship, really growing in times to come.
Jasmine Crawford-Hill from the Australia-India Youth Dialogue. We've heard about democratising and diversifying manufacturing and supply chains, but nothing about the beginning of that cycle, about the need to democratise and potentially diversify R&D and who holds IP. And I think we did start to see this through COVID with vaccines and access. What does it look like if we're going to talk about embedding values and culture, not just into our manufacturing and supply chains, but into our research? Then is there a need for us to lead the region in democratising research as well?
From an Indian perspective, this is a very valid question, because it's been a big source of concern for us when it comes to policy making. A sense that we are underinvested in R&D. And we are. I think a large part of the problem derives from the fact that we are underinvested in manufacturing. So you can't you can't have a strong R&D economy and a weak manufacturing economy. They don't go together. And in previous years, quite honestly, we made life difficult for ourselves when it came to manufacturing through a set of policy decisions which were taken. And a lot of our inabilities and shortcomings were actually rationalized, saying, we are Indians, our real strength is in services, which was a good cop-out of what you failed to do. That is today getting addressed. So if you look at the last few years, there's been a huge push to expand and intensify manufacturing. There's even the HR support. I mean, the emphasis on skills, on vocational education, on innovation, on startups, on patents. This is almost like a new culture which is taking place, and I can see it actually taking root. I visit a lot of educational institutions across India. 10 years ago, if I went somewhere, they would trot out the best 5 students and say, these are the gold medalists of our institution. Today they say, give us half an hour, we want to put a display and we want to introduce you to 5 people who hold patents while they're still studying in the university. That to me is a big mindset shift. I accept that we have a long way to go there. I think the Prime Minister and the government knows that. But it is today a course correction that we have made. I think we have made that very decisively. We now need to really intensify it. We have this initiative called Production Linked Incentive Program, which is designed to actually get countries to come in, collaborate with us. I'm hearing more and more anecdotal evidence of global companies setting R&D up in India. We're trying to make it easier for them. So yes, work in progress, but honestly, a lot of work to be done.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. Minister Jaishankar, Minister Bowen, thank you for being the ministers involved with the inaugural Raisina at Sydney, from foreign policy to climate policy to energy security and democracy, and how technology impacts all of them. It has shown the breadth and importance of the Australia-India relationship. So please let's thank both ministers.
Thank you.